program for you today. We've got a couple excellent speakers that are going to talk about the nature and origin of Freemasonry. But before we begin, let's invoke the blessings of deity. May the blessings of heaven be upon this meeting, and as it has happily begun, may it be conducted in order and closed in harmony. Amen. Please stay standing for Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Well, hopefully you were all able to pick up a copy of the program before you came in here. So let me explain a little bit about how the day is going to be conducted. So we'll begin with a presentation of certificates for those who are part of the Masonic Scholars Program. And after that, Brother Ben Williams will give a talk on the sun at high meridian, on the history and discovery of longitude. Then we'll have time for question and answer. Then we'll break for lunch. And after lunch, Brother Oscar Allen will give us a talk on exploring the relationship between French companionship and Freemasonry. Again, we'll have some time for questions and answers, and then we'll be adjourned. But let's begin with the presentation of certificates. So as you should know, the Academy of Masonic Knowledge does more than just have these two meetings a year here at Elizabethtown, where we have internationally known speakers talk about various aspects of Freemasonry. We also have a Masonic Scholar Program. And people who are willing to study the craft and write papers, read books, give presentations, earn Masonic education units. And there's 3 grades, level 1, level 2, and once you make it to grade 3, you become a Master Masonic Scholar. So now is the time to recognize those who have completed various stages in their Masonic journey in the Masonic Scholar Program. So for level 1, we have Tim Brinkmeyer. Is Tim with us today? Tim recently moved, so he may not be here. Thomas M. Fewer. There's Tom. Let's give him a round of applause. Congratulations, Tom. There you go. Okay. Robert Hughes. Is Robert with us this morning? Eric W. Krogstad. Is Eric here? Walter S. Muller. Congratulations, Walter. We have one brother who earned the level 2 Masonic Scholar, Jeremy R. Johnson. Is Jeremy here today? No? And we have one brother with us this morning who earned his Master Masonic Scholar Jewel, Louis R. Laza. Is Louis here? Here he comes. Congratulations, Louis. So PJ, Gene would like to know if you have a camera that we could take some pictures with. Okay. So with the Master Masonic Scholar Award goes a collar and a jewel, and that is normally awarded at a quarterly communication by the Grand Master himself. So if you can't attend the quarterly communication, it can be awarded by your district deputy at your lodge. There we go. Another round of applause. Well, in addition to recognizing those who have just completed various levels of their Masonic Scholar program, we usually recognize those who have already completed various aspects of their program. So would all the Level 1 Master Masonic Scholars please stand up? Any Level 1s here? Level 2 Master Masonic Scholars? There we go. A couple here. And Level 3 Master Masonic Scholars. You can recognize them by their collar and jewel. Congratulations, brothers. Well, it is my great pleasure to introduce Brother Ben Williams. So last night he and Jean had a heated conversation for about 3 hours, then Jean went to bed, and then he and I had a heated conversation for about another 3 hours. So I hope he's got enough energy left to, to give us this talk. But very entertaining, very engaging, very articulate person. I think that you're going to enjoy his presentation. So Brother Ben is a past master of Telluride Lodge number 56 and Norwood Lodge number 111 in Colorado. He serves as secretary of the Research Lodge of Colorado and as chair of the Grand Lodge of Colorado's Education Committee. He currently serves the Grand Commandery of Knights Templar of Colorado as the VE Deputy Grand Commander, and he was honored as Mason of the Year by the Grand Lodge of Colorado in 2015. A registered patent agent, he operates Williams Intellectual Property, where he authors patents on behalf of individual inventors and corporate clients. He lives in Littleton, Colorado, and with his patient and loving wife, Tiffany, and their new daughter, Adeline. If you would please welcome Brother Ben Williams.
Brethren, thank you very much. That's a lot to live up to. And the conversation we were having is a fascinating discussion that was on the nature of self and the immortality of the soul. So if anybody wants to talk with Ted about that at any time, just corner him and enjoy what follows, because it's been very edifying. Gentlemen, the topic of my talk today is on the history of the longitude. Can everybody hear me okay? How close to this microphone do I need to stand? This is good. So my principal sources for this talk are David Sobel's book on the same subject. It's got a rather long title, about the lone genius who solved the problem of the longitude, and also the Nova special, which I commend to your attention if you want further information on this fascinating topic. And I'd like to begin by just saying that England here is not in crosshairs. That is just the prime meridian. I'm not suggesting anything there, obviously. So a very quick refresher for those of you who may be unfamiliar with the way we as humans divide up the world spatially. So here's a globe. Latitude, of course, are in parallels and go from 0 latitude at the equator and extend to the 90th parallel, if you will, on either pole. Longitude is horizontal or vertical sections and our meridians. The latitude is fairly easy to determine. I should preface my remarks also by explaining the Masonic connection, if you will, with this talk. This period, which we'll be discussing, takes place in the 18th century. And I'm not 100% familiar with Pennsylvania work, but I presume, do we have any non-Masons in the room? So in the opening, the sun at high meridian, the glory and beauty of the day is what our junior warden would say. And in our fellow craft stair lecture, we discuss the globes and the sciences of astronomy, geography, and navigation, and the arts dependent upon them by which humanity has been so much benefited. So we discuss this and allude to this science, if you will. And I hope during this talk to illustrate a dichotomy between two worldviews, the worldview pre the Enlightenment and the worldview post the Enlightenment. And this particular subject is right between the wrestling match, if you will, between these worldviews and great men of science and learning, and the struggle between the emergence of men of merit and new understandings. So bear that in mind as we go through really a history lesson that is not much other connected to the fraternity. So I hope that's acceptable. So the latitude. The latitude is very easy to discern. One can take the sun at a known day, the sun moving as it does throughout the year, and subtend an angle down to the horizon. You can do this with the North Star at night, and you can use your fist as about 10 degrees and approximate your latitude quite easily. Is everybody familiar with this symbol that we see usually on the southern hemisphere on globes? This is called the analemma, and it is basically, if we took a photograph of the sun at the same time each day, it draws this sort of figure-8 shape. So I've got two questions. I usually like to give out prizes to folks, but since I'm up here, I won't. In this case, this would be the longest day of the year, correct? So this would be June 21st, 23rd, 19th, somewhere around there. And the sun would descend each noon to this point right here, and descend again each day until, around St. John the Evangelist's Day, it would cease in its downward movement and would again begin to rise every noon and cross again at this point here. So we can say if this fellow on the ship is drawing the latitude on this noon, you can estimate what date this is. Any takers? Right, it's either March or the autumnal equinox, so either September or March 21st. And I can tell you one other thing. This is actually in the southern hemisphere because of the way this analemma is shaped. If it was the other way, we'd be in the north. So in this sense, this would be December, and that would be June. And you can tell that just from that picture, that this boat must be south of the equator. So we use the sextant, of course, to discern the sun at high meridian, and we use things like the astrolabe in the old days to traverse the deserts and understand the rising of the stars. So again, the sun repeats its positions throughout the day. We have a table of solar positions. We can determine our latitude. But how do you determine the longitude? This is a question that vexed humanity for hundreds of years. It's also incredibly difficult to determine your position at the sea. There are no known markers. When you're heading east or west, it is all the same. Variable weather can move you from one site to another. The most common practice was to sail your ship out of a port, turn north, and move along the coast to a known latitude, and then direct your ship due west, and you would come to Bridgeport, let's say, in Barbados. Then you would turn around and you would east along the same shipping lanes. This, of course, was somewhat problematic because during times of naval warfare, it was fairly easy to anticipate your opponent's position. And this was also very useful for pirates who would be able to lie in wait along these known eastings or westings. Essentially, they would use the log and line technique. They'd throw a log out, they would turn over an hourglass, and they would approximate their number of knots on the rope. And thus, using the compasses, they would project their supposed position relative to a latitude. If they get blown, of course, they would try to come back using the circles and the compasses. And they called that, appropriately enough, dead reckoning. An error of half a degree is equivalent to approximately 15 nautical miles at the equator. So you can imagine how easy it would be to lose track of where you are if your log and line is not particularly accurate. And if you're just throwing this overboard and the variances of the wind, obviously your speed is going to be variable. So these errors compounded rather quickly, resulting in ships getting lost. This is an interesting point. It was considered mutiny for anyone other than the ship's captain or his designee to maintain the log and the navigation. If you were to disagree with the navigator or the captain, it was punishable by death. So here's a very brief history of how long this problem of determining the longitude has been vexing humanity. In the 4th century, Aristarchus of Samos presented the first known model of a heliocentric galaxy, solar system. In the 3rd century BC, Aristophanes of Cyrene proposed a system of cartography that had a graticulate arrangement comprising a supposed latitude and longitude. 2nd century, Hipparchus of Nicaea did a similar endeavor. By the 11th century, we have Al-Biruni alleging that the Earth was spherical and rotated upon its own axis. That is also part of our fellowcraft degree, at least in Colorado, discussing the globe upon its own axis. By the 13th century, King Alphonse the Wise of Castile sponsored a scriptorium, where the determination of the ascending degree was again recovered and popularized from the ancient Greek sources. It was under his auspices that various books were translated that have had a significant impact on Renaissance and Western thought. In 1465, Regiomontanus published the annual almanacs of planetary positions, which people use to determine the longitude. We'll be talking more about the lunarian method fairly soon. But this is important for Columbus because it saved his life. Without that almanac, he would never have survived his encounter on Jamaica, where he was able to predict the solar eclipse and thus convince his captors that he had powers and abilities beyond the mortal man, and thus was released. In 1748, Rabbi Zucato, the astronomer royal to the King John II of Portugal, invented a new astrolabe, able to determine latitude at sea. Of course, it's hard to hold something steady with the pitch and yaw of a vessel. By 1514, Johannes Werner published the first method of determining time by the position of the stars. King Philip of Spain offered the first prize for the solution of the longitude. At this point, the maritime powers of Europe were abutting each other. So it became more and more necessary, if you will, to determine the longitude. It was still unsolved almost by 1600, so the prize was increased to 6,000 ducats. By the middle of the 17th century, Holland offered 10,000 florins for anyone who could discover the solution to the longitude problem. The French Academy of Sciences was established in 1666, same time of the Great Fire of London, and chief among its principal rationales for founding was to stimulate discovery of the longitude. This was Galileo's proposed solution. Galileo, who had noticed the moons around Jupiter, developed the celestone. His plan was that this happy fellow, wearing this helmet with this telescope, would stand in a hemispherical body nested within another hemispherical body, separated by a thin layer of oil, so that it would self-level on the deck of a ship. And in this self-leveling, nested hemispherical arrangement of parts, this fellow with that hat would look at Jupiter and time from the orbits of the moons, which he believed were regular repeating arrangements. So he would know the time of day relative a home port, and thus the differential would enable him to determine the longitude. Another guy came up with an idea of anchoring ships together across the entire Atlantic, and this was actually submitted to the Board of Longitude. Their plan, it was two of them, was to, at noon in England, was to set off a firework or shoot a cannon, make a loud noise. The first ship, hearing the noise, would jettison another one, and in sequence, across the entire Atlantic, each of these boats would jettison its loud, visible noise, and thus people would know that it's noon in England and would be able to determine their latitude relative to the sun and their observations at that time. That was actually submitted. It did not win the prize. I realize that probably seems shocking. All right, let's get into the main stimulus for the creation of the Board of Longitude. So note the year, 10 years before the Goose and the Gridiron pub. The War of the Spanish Succession is raging. This unlikely named fellow, Sir Cloudesley Shovel, is the admiral of the British forces. They're returning from the Mediterranean through the Pillars of Hercules after a supporting role in the Battle of Toulon. September 29th, 1707. There's 15 ships of the line. These are the multiple decked, multiple masted. These are the aircraft carriers of their day. They are the prime jewels in the British Armada. And they pass the Pillar of Hercules, and they get blown off course by inclement weather. The navigator made his numbers, and he had them safely west of the Scilly Isles about October 22nd. So almost a month later, it's taken them to return to their course. But he was wrong, and 4 ships of the line wrecked on the rocks and took 2,000 souls. Note the word, Ted, 2,000 souls to Davy Jones' locker, including those 4 vessels there, and including the unfortunate Sir Cloudesley Shovel. This was the greatest naval disaster in British maritime history, and not a shot had been fired. So this is where they were here. They were heading back to Portsmouth from down here, and they'd come up, and the navigator had them here, but they were there, and they wrecked right in this area. So it only took the British government 7 years to deliberate on this problem. Not much has changed, gentlemen. So in 1714, the British Parliament passed the Longitude Act, and it established this board of educated professionals, if you will, and a £20,000 cash prize. The discovery of the longitude is of such consequence to Great Britain for the safety of the Navy and merchant ships, as well as for the improvement of trade, that for want thereof, many ships have been retarded in their voyages, and many lost. So approximately £20,000 is, depending on how you want to look at it, is quite a lot of money. On the high extreme end, the equivalent today would be about 400 million. On the low end, it's still about 40 million. So this would make somebody one of the richest men in the world if they could solve the Longitude Act. Now, it had various tiers. There was £10,000 if you could get within 60 nautical miles of the known longitude. 60 nautical miles is quite a big radius, correct? And 15,000 if you could get within 20 nautical miles. The £20,000 prize was to be within 30 nautical miles of the longitude. At this point, there were already 2 competing methods that had come to the fore. On the one hand was the lunar distance method, which I'll talk about significantly in a moment, and versus the marine chronometer. The idea was that if you could determine the time of an event at your home location, the observation of that event west would occur earlier, east would occur later. And thus you could determine your distance from your home port, east or west, if you knew how you could catalog time as witnessed at your home port. So the Lunarian method, which we will talk about, used the conjunctions of the planets, the aspects of the moon, particularly with many fixed stars. And of course, the marine chronometer was just keeping time in your pocket. Sir Isaac Newton wrote of the marine chronometer method that it was true in the theory, but difficult in its execution. This shows automatically that the greatest minds of English learning believed the marine chronometer method to be awkward and lost. They wanted the Lunarian method to succeed, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more. So in 1675, previous to the Longitude Act, King Charles II had commissioned the construction of Greenwich Observatory. Greenwich Observatory's prime role was to observe the planetary positions and thus issue an annual almanac that navigators could use to determine the time of observations at London and thus extrapolate to their position east or west of this prime meridian, which would run through Greenwich. He also appointed an astronomer royal, John Flamsteed, who would do this. Does anybody want to hazard a guess at who was commissioned to build Greenwich Observatory? Has anybody here heard of Christopher Wren? Aha, significant to the craft, perhaps. So this is interesting. When I was in school, when I took Astronomy 101, I was told that John Flamsteed and Johannes Kepler were the first of the real astronomers, that before them, this spurious science of astrology had adulterated and still consumed their understandings of the more noble numbering of the stars. However, John Flamsteed elected this chart as the cornerstone laying ceremony for Greenwich Observatory. And he wrote on it a Cicero quote, "Risum tenitis amici." Can my friends refrain from laughing? In the official record, scientists point to this and say, well, he was joking. And that's why he put this "Risum tenitis amici" on there. He was quoting Cicero. It's a joke. He didn't believe in astrology. This is absurd. The problem with that theory is he's done his work as an electional astrologer, which is very time-consuming and involves some complicated calculations, to place Jupiter in his own sign on the horizon. So Greenwich Observatory was laid, the foundation, as Jupiter was rising in the east. And he fortified some other planets in other ways that shows he was not just a student of medieval astrology, but he understood it, and he embodied it in this chart. This was not the first time that astrology had been used to support, if you will, an undertaking of a building. In 1576, as example, Tycho Brahe, another very famous astronomer, had been employed by the Vatican to lay the cornerstone of one of their wings. I'm forgetting the name of the wing. I thought I had it in my notes, but I don't. And he also did a cornerstone ceremony on his own observatory on the island of Haven, off of Norway. So here it is. This is Greenwich Observatory, designed and overseen by Christopher Wren, perhaps the first Grand Master of the speculative craft. And here it is again at night with this rather curious laser beam shooting out the side. Would anybody like to hazard a guess as to what this laser beam is? It's supposed to be the prime meridian. It's supposed to demark 0 longitude. However, with GPS and the like, they've discovered that it was a couple of feet off. But that's okay. There it is, the prime meridian, 0 longitude. So now we're going to talk about the lunarian method. So I've already shown you that the Astronomer Royal, whose job was to number the stars and produce an almanac of the planetary positions, without any sort of qualifying, spurious astrological associations, just their mathematically accurate positions. And his job was to show this. Here is the moon. The moon is this far away from, in this example, Regulus. Here's the altitude of Regulus, so we know where we are by our latitude, and thus we can coordinate this distance and when this event would have happened in London. And if this event happened in London, earlier in the day, then I know that I am east of London. If it happened in London, later than me, in other words, it would be noon there tomorrow, even though it's happening at the same time, correct? I would know that I am west of London. So there's a lot more you can tell about this from this arrangement. Right here, I can tell you that it's spring again. This is probably early April. And I can tell you this because the moon is a waxing crescent. The first moon appearing in Taurus happens when the sun is in Aries. The sun must have just set for this picture to be relevant. Because the moon is in Taurus, waxing as a crescent, it can only be early April. I can also tell you the ship's position because of that. He must be in the north. And I can tell you, this constellation also gives us more information. So this is kind of how the lunar distance method was supposed to have worked. The plan then was to maintain time at the prime meridian and verify the discrepancy with local noon and other times. The problem was, of course, you had a 15-degree differential for every hour that you were off. Every hour, if it's noon in London and it's 1 p.m. that we're having the same event, I'm 15 miles one side or the other. But it's very difficult to make these observations. It's very difficult to make these observations on a boat when it's moving, when the clouds are obscuring the sky. So the marine chronometer was the other method that was presented. The first one was developed in the 1720s by Henry Sully, but it was only accurate on calm seas. The forces of the pitch and the yaw would throw out the balances. Also, it's a horrible environment for any clock to operate, being on a boat. The humidity swells the wood. Everything is based on a pendulum in these early clocks, and your pendulum grows with the heat of the day when you're in the Caribbean, your seconds get longer. When you go north and it gets colder and your pendulum shrinks, time speeds up. It was very difficult to maintain an accurate clock, especially on the sea. But enter John Harrison. John Harrison was born April 3rd in the West Riding of Yorkshire. His father was a carpenter. He was employed by Sir Rowland Wynne at the Nostell Priory estate. That's a reference to an encampment of Knights Templars back in the day, by the way. He was self-educated for the main. In this time in England, you pretty much did what your father did. That was what was expected of you. So he became a joiner and became a carpenter. The story is that around the turn of the century, he was ill, probably with smallpox, and somebody gave him one of these new pocket watches that were being developed. And the interior workings of its mechanism gave him much delight during his convalescence. So he developed a love of horology. In 1713, he was 20 years old, he built his first long case clock. It was entirely made out of wood. And this was a bit of a phenomenon for its time because wood is less conductive of heat. So it resisted these expansion-contraction anomalies that would occur with the variance of the seasons. As a result, it was one of the most accurate clocks of its time. He gained some renown from this fact, and come the 1720s, he built the turret clock at Brocklesby Park, which still functions today, and it still keeps very accurate time. It's also made entirely out of wood. It used a very hard wood. This means the living wood. You don't have to lubricate this wood, lignum vitae. It's from the Caribbean. And it used his famous grasshopper escarpment, which I'm going to see if I can get this to work. There it is. It does different times, so they only made it one time. This has a very novel way of releasing the driving mechanism of the clock and transferring it into the hands. This was the most accurate clock. It was more than 60 years ahead of its time. So doing all this, he determined that if he could make a clock as accurate as he had made on land to function on sea, he might well become a gentleman and inherit that 20,000-pound prize. Among other things, he invented this remarkable device, which was the precursor to the bimetallic strip. He had two competing forms of metal, each with a different conductance of heat. The expansion in one direction would be counteracted by the contraction or expansion in the other direction across this arrangement of floating bridges. So the overall pendulum would maintain its linear distance despite how hot and cold it was. This was also way ahead of its time. It lost 1 second a month. It was more than 150 years ahead of any other competing horologist. But remember, he's just a joiner from northern Yorkshire. He designs his first sea clock, this giant beast. I'm not going to read through all of this stuff, but he traveled to London to show Sir Edmund Halley, who was then the second Astronomer Royal, this giant contraption. And Halley is impressed enough that he suggests he brings it to the Board of Longitude, and he introduced him to George Graham, who was the leading horologist of its time. There it is. This is what we call H1. This thing was so big that when they took it to the boat for its first voyage, they had to take the doors off of the captain's cabin to fit it in there. It was just humongous. His plan was that these globes mounted on these two column-like bodies would counterbalance each other against a spring mechanism. So the Royal Society was impressed enough with it, and they gave their consent to the first sea trial. So he boarded HMS Centurion, bound for Lisbon. And it kept really good time throughout the voyage, but it mysteriously lost 4 minutes on the very first day. This really confused Harrison. He could not determine why it was losing so much time at the very beginning. Its going rate was about 1 second per week. So it doesn't matter if your clock is losing time, as long as it does it consistently. You can counter that error into the computations. But on the return voyage, it worked just fine. And he accurately predicted their landfall, and the navigator was off by over 60 nautical miles. In fact, if Harrison hadn't been aboard that vessel, it is likely they would have sank. So the captain of that ship would become a great ally to Harrison at a later time when he needed him, and would testify before the Board of Longitude that his clock had saved that ship's life. And on the basis of the captain's testimony, the Board of Longitude agreed to finance £500 for a further developed clock for the transatlantic voyage that the prize required. So in 1741, while he's messing around with his second design, he discovers what went wrong. The reason he lost 4 minutes on the way out of the harbor is he hadn't solved for the inertia of the vessel while it was tacking. And because they tacked multiple times to get out of Portsmouth into the sea, the force of that motion was throwing out his balances. He had solved for the up and down, the pitch, the yaw, and the left and the right, but he hadn't solved for the drag, the inertia of the acceleration of the vessel pitching. So he decided to make a new balance, which he also invented. But unfortunately, the war with the Spanish succession delayed the marine testing. I'm sorry, it's the War of Jenkins' Ear. And the Austrian succession. And I'm not going to go into that because we don't have much time, but that's a very odd war that happened, the War of Jenkins' Ear. If you get bored one day, research into the War of Jenkins' Ear. This shows the competing powers at the time, the superpowers of the world struggling for supremacy, and why the longitude was so important to global primacy. So the border longitude gives him another 500 pounds to work on this new circular balance design. He now departs from this giant clock system, and he goes into making the pocket watch sort of shaped devices with which we're all familiar. In the 1750s, he moves to London, and that is when he made his round watches. I'm gonna skip some of this right here, since I don't want to talk too much about this stuff. But basically, he gives up this. He invents this going fusee, which is an ability to wind the clock without having to stop it, so that it can keep time. He's now compacted things into a very round, compact device. I'll show you a picture in a second. He had this frictional rest escapement, and he had this novel temperature compensation using bimetallic materials. So he basically incorporated the bimetallic strip interior to his clock. And lo and behold, he makes H4, which becomes the first marine chronometer capable of accurately predicting the ship's longitude at sea. But he still needed the transatlantic voyage to prove it to the board. So in 1761, Harrison's already an old man, so his son boards HMS Deptford for Jamaica. It lost about 30 seconds every 9 days. That was its going rate. It would consistently lose that. And upon arrival, they were off by 5 seconds when they counted in the going rate, an error of only 1 nautical mile, well within the 30 nautical mile requirement to win the entire prize. So they returned to England, but the Board of Longitude refused and withheld the prize. They weren't sure if the accuracy was a result of chance. They didn't necessarily believe that it was replicable. It took him more than 6 years to build this clock. Those earlier ones he built, it would take him 8 hours to assemble and 8 hours to reassemble every time he needed to make an adjustment. So they gave him $5,000. They offered him 5,000 pounds, excuse me, for the design, but he refused. Part of the reason for this is because of this competing worldview. Here we have the world of man's contrivance, an apparatus in his pocket, something that he has made and that he can look to in the palm of his hand. But the Board of Longitude was consumed with this greater worldview, this idea that the passage of time was the revelation of the will of God. So we need to talk about Reverend Dr. Neville Maskelyne. He was born at 1732. He became the 5th Astronomer Royal. He was educated at Catherine's College in Cambridge. He was ordained as a minister and became a Trinity College, Cambridge, a fellow. In 1756, he was admitted to the Royal Society and thus was no stranger to our craft. In 1760, he was the guy that was appointed to observe the transit of Venus in 1761. And although the inclement weather, he sailed all the way, I think it was to Africa, basically obscured the event, he nonetheless used the trip to determine a new lunar distance method. His plan, as the Astronomer Royal, was to write these almanacs and sell them using his lunar distance method. So in 1763, he published the British Mariner's Guide, and it recommended the use of his almanac, particularly for determining the ship's position at sea. Isaac Newton wrote, "I have told the world oftener than once that the longitude cannot be found by watchmakers, but by the ablest astronomers. I am unwilling to meddle with any other method than the right one." And the right one was God's method, right? And this is Isaac Newton. This is Isaac Newton saying this. So you can see that there is this acceptance of astrology. That's really what we're talking about, even though it's astronomy. I mean, these guys have inherited a tradition that goes back to the ancient Greeks, and they've been educated in Latin and Greek at the finest schools, and they've undertaken a mystical learning. This picture of him, of Maskelyne, shows him holding an almanac with Jupiter and Saturn, the greater benefic and the greater malefic, time and plenty. This image, as simple as it may seem, shows Maskelyne as the master of time and the master of divinity. That's what that picture would show to somebody in that time period. So to come along with a clock, which is just this little functioning machine, seemed to prostitute so great a science. And Harrison wrote in his diary, "They said a clock can be but a clock, and the performance of mind, though nearly to truth itself, must be altogether a deception. Is it a demon that is in that clock that is making it operate? How does that clock work, Mr. Harrison? How do we know it's really even a clock? Who needs a clock? We have noon. I can see the sun at its high meridian, the glory and beauty of the day. I need not your clock to tell me the time, Mr. Harrison. I say, for the love of money, these professors or priests have preferred their cumbersome lunar method. Bear in mind, it took half an hour to perform the computations. So while you're sitting in your captain's quarters crunching these numbers to determine the lunar distance method, the ship, of course, is still moving. Plus, you had to have made the right observation to begin with. You'd have to measure that distance on a ship in the parting of the clouds in the darkest night. It wasn't particularly efficient. Certainly, Parson Maskelyne would never concern himself with such a matter if money were not at bottom. And yet these university men must be my masters, knowing nothing at all of the matter farther than one wheel turns another, my mere clock being not only repugnant to their learning, but also a loss of a booty to them. I liken his distaste with the Board of Longitude to the way that Benjamin Franklin must have felt when, having appealed to the Parliament that the colony was slipping through their grasp, give us control of our own money for Pete's sake, you silly Englishmen. And they said to him, look at the poor American, oh gosh. This class system is what he was railing against. This class system is what Benjamin Franklin also fought against, if you will. He entered a loyalist and he left a revolutionary. I think John Harrison would sympathize. So a second transatlantic test was scheduled by the board. It was aboard HMS Tartar, bound for Bridgetown, Barbados. Neville Maskelyne, member of the board, was sent along with H4 to concurrently test the preferred, but more difficult, lunar distance method. Maskelyne got them within 30 miles of Bridgetown's longitude. So he almost fulfilled the prize. But H4 only lost 39 seconds, and it was within 10 miles. So by a factor of 3, Harrison's clock had won. But upon the return to London in 1765, Maskelyne is appointed the 5th Astronomer Royal, which automatically placed him on the Board of Longitude. Thus, with a slight conflict of interest, he returned an unfavorable report of H4 to the board, saying, well, you know, this could really just be a random result, and I think you should give me the money, is essentially what he was saying. So the prize was withheld. And Harrison, who had worked for most of his life, now 72 years of age, was withheld the prize. He was, to quote him, extremely ill-used. But he buries himself in his work and begins to work on H5. And this is what he wrote in his diary. Justice as touching my reward or encouragement has been scandalously frustrated. Mr. Graham, the finest clockmaker of the day, said to several gentlemen that I deserved the 20,000, and you can hear his distaste in these words. Yet the board has turned me into a slave. Well, they took great care about my watch, for they also locked it up for some time in a closet at the Admiralty, because it had performed 2 voyages so well. So now there was a concern, if it isn't random chance, we can't let this fall into the hands of the Spanish. We better lock this thing up. We better seal this thing away. And so they would keep as a piece of treasure for fear that nobody else would be able to make another. It is a fair sign indeed that they did not understand it, Nay, my timekeeper is beyond the reach of both the latitude and the longitude of these villainous priests of Cambridge and Oxford. The trouble which these lunar men have occasioned me. They were lunatics, in his opinion. With no other option, comes 1772. Harrison does what any God-fearing Englishman would do. He petitions the king. Now, King George III is actually interested in this problem. He was a bit of a man of science, as it happens. So he granted Harrison an audience and took H5 and personally tested it himself on land over 10 weeks, putting it in the back, riding with a horse, putting it on a cart, you know, subjecting it to lots of different forces, and was impressed enough that it was accurate within 1/3 of a second each day that he censured the Board of Longitude and advised Harrison to petition the Parliament. So Harrison's now 80 years old. He's worked on this problem his whole life. He solved it empirically, and he received £8,750 by a special act of Parliament. He never actually won the prize. The Board of Longitude refused to give it to him. And I think primarily because he was a joiner from Yorkshire and not a man from Oxford. And after 3 years later, after being made a millionaire, he dies. But it's not as sad as it sounds, because over the course of his life, he did receive a lot of money, £23,000, but he sank it all into his work. He got $4,000 from the board over the course of his life, which funded the research of his clocks. He got $10,000 from Parliament for the design of H4 just before he died, and he got another $8,000 by a special act of Parliament. They did also make these awards: Lunar, Timekeeper, Lifetime Achievement, Lunar, Engine Divided Sextant, so that's more Lunar, Improvements H5, Lunar. So there's a couple of timekeepers, but the majority, again, is the lunar distance method. Excitingly, Captain Cook used the copy of H4 on his second and third voyages. And with Harrison's now working marine chronometer, Captain Cook charted the entire Southern Oceans. They were the best maps in the world. This gave England the maritime supremacy for which she is quite famous. And it was all simply down to this one man. Captain Cook loved this watch. Interestingly, it was loaned to William Bligh, but retained by Fletcher Christian after the mutiny on the Bounty. Are you guys familiar with this story? Right? So Fletcher Christian, he's no idiot. He's like, I'm taking that clock, you're getting in the boat, you know, sir. And fortunately for William Bligh, he appealed to Fletcher Christian's better nature and said, well, at least let me take the almanac, man. You know, at least let me have the planetary tables, because you're going to put me out here in the middle of the Southern Ocean, we're going to die. So he gave him the almanac. And miraculously, Bligh, in probably one of the greatest feats of navigation in the world, using the lunar distance method at sea in a dinghy, without any paper, really, managed to sail his boat over, like, what, 3 weeks? 3,500 nautical miles to Kupang in Timor from April 28th to June 14th in 1789. And I don't remember exactly, but I think everybody in the boat survived, or only a couple of them died, which is just absolutely amazing. So I'm going to leave you with this. John Harrison, a man of merit, a working man, a man who devoted himself to the discovery of the longitude and making serious, significant advances in the science of horology, said, I can boldly say that no timekeeper, whether in the pendulum way or that of the balance, can ever be able to go any truer or better than mine. And now at sea the longitude may be had with great certainty and exactness. I have indeed had a long deal of labor, but I thank God I've got it through. Gentlemen, the keeping of time and the movement of society are much entwined. From the earliest standing circles to the chronometer to the modern period, where we use the timed oscillation of cesium atoms and strontium atoms to lose a second in over 20 million years, shows the advancement of human progress. Timekeeping is a science that is difficult and peculiar. It is a distance between events, but how do you measure the metronome objectively that beats into nothing? If you divorce time from the movements of the stars, you bring it to a regular rhythm. We're now at losing 1 second every 20 million years. If you think about how accurate that clock is, it's almost absurd. Why do we need that sort of accuracy? Well, for satellites, for online trading. And yet there will be further developments in the keeping of time that will need to be made. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I appreciate it. Do we have any questions?
So what we'll do, we'll take a break and
Sure.
set up the table and we'll take questions after that.
You got it. Cool. I finished early. So.
That's great. Well, thanks, Brother Ben. I was a part of history that I had no idea about. I didn't realize that this was so important. So what we'll do now is we'll break. We'll set up for questions, and we'll pass a microphone back and forth up and down the rows here. And anybody who has some questions for Brother Ben can ask him at that time, or members of the Academy of Masonic Knowledge will be up here too. So we'll see you in about 15, 20 minutes.
why you pay Roy. That's why I don't work here anymore.
Oscar, do you want me to leave this up here? I'll leave it right there. I put the little nodule on the top too. So I'll come down.
Okay, thank you. So here says to say hello. He unfortunately has to be at a Christmas night luncheon. He's going to come say I saw him Wednesday in
Well, gentlemen, I think we're ready to begin. If the people out in the hallway could come into the main auditorium here. And if the members of the committee could come and sit up here. Brother Ben, you're on the hot seat here. We got Erastus and Yasser is not with us. If we can get Brother Mike Moran up here.
Right here? Right here?
Yeah, right there.
Right here.
That'll be good.
I feel like I'm in some sort of delegation.
Well, before we start the question and answer session, we have two of our level 1 scholars that have arrived at the meeting, and since we've got their certificates, I think we ought to award them while they're here. So, Brother Robert Hughes, will you please come forward and get your level 1 Masonic Scholar Certificate? Is Brother Hughes in here? There he is. Congratulations, Brother Hughes. And I know that Brother Eric Krogstad is here as well. Eric, if you'd please come forward. Congratulations, Eric. Well, since Paul Fisher is not here to conduct the question and answer session, I'll have to try to do my best Paul Fisher impersonation. But Paul would always begin this by saying that, of course, the purpose of this session is to extract information from our speakers and members of the committee, so you should keep your questions as clear and concise and succinct and to the point as you can. Paul used to admonish us not to give diatribes, not to give anecdotes and so forth, but to stay on topic and address questions to the speaker. So we have two people with microphones, and if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand. They'll bring the microphone down to you. Please give us your name and your lodge affiliation. And I should also mention we're being live streamed over the internet now, so any of our members on the internet that are watching are welcome to type in a question, and we'll put those questions to our speaker as well. So without further ado, any questions? I know that we've got one down here.
Good evening, all brothers. My name is Salman Sheikh from St. Alban 529. And I was curious about Brother John Harrison. Thank you for your speech. I really learned a lot, and it's very unique. I'll have to visit you in Colorado.
Please do.
But I wanted to ask you, with John Harrison from Royal Society, now was Royal Society equivalent to Freemasonry at that time? Was he a brother of the craft?
That's a great question. I don't think John Harrison was a brother. Oh, do I need to turn this on? Check, check. Sorry, guys. I don't think John Harrison was a brother. At least there's no evidence that I have found to determine that he was. He was not also a member of the Royal Society, but a naval masculine was. So the Royal Society was not comprised entirely of Masons, but it certainly appears to have had a Masonic connection. Many of the fellows discussed in its early formation scientific heresies, if you will, that Freemasonry certainly, I think, adopted down the road. I wouldn't say they adopted heresies, but the science that was discussed by the Royal Society. So there's definitely a crossover. I'm not sure it's accurate to say the one engendered the other entirely, but does that make sense? Sort of a rambling answer there. You're welcome. Thank you.
Good morning. Rick Chrissinger from York Lodge number 266. My question is kind of to extrapolate from the end of your presentation, the understanding or mastering of longitude. To what extent did that benefit or contribute to the British naval dominance of that time period? I would imagine it helped. But
That's an incredible question. No, I would argue it was indispensable to England's maritime supremacy. England, after the discovery of the longitude, could make the best, most accurate maps mankind had ever authored on all of the shipping lanes. I argue that it was the greatest military intelligence of its age, and it's certainly, rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves. The ruling of the waves, I argue, is the determination of the longitude. I think that song may predate that time, but nonetheless, very good question. Yep.
Good morning. My name is Dan Powell. I'm from Jepta Lodge number 222 in Essex, Maryland. My question is, how long did the British hold on to this secret or onto this technology before it became widely available throughout the world?
That is a great question, and unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that, but I will look into that. It's a very good question. I would imagine, and I'm going to totally guess, probably 50 years. I'm sure that it leaked somehow, probably. But no, very good question indeed. I should know the answer to that, so I will definitely look into it. I was gonna say, there's obviously more to maritime supremacy than just the longitude, but yeah, I don't know when the next closest discoverer was, if that makes sense. When you look at watch commercials in most magazines, when I was a kid, I always wondered why they had this nautical kind of imagery associated with them. And this is certainly why. But you'll have to give me your email address, and I'll find out for you.
So I have a question about Christopher Wren and his relationship to all of this. So could you expound on that a little bit?
Sure. Christopher Wren, who was, many believe, I'm not an expert on his Masonic affiliation or not, but many people believe that he was one of the earliest Grand Masters of the speculative gentleman's masonry. So his main, I think, contribution to this discovery was the design of Greenwich Observatory. So the prime meridian was probably going to end up in Paris if it hadn't been, arguably, for Greenwich Observatory. And the Royal Observatory at Greenwich was, state-of-its-art astronomical capturing, if you will, in its day. So that also was a very important technology, even though it's just brick and mortar. It was a telescope, and they would obviously sit there and make their observations and determine predictions for the planetary positions. And these occultations of stars, these aspects to stars, as witnessable from Greenwich Observatory, gave us the time in those almanacs. So zero longitude is Greenwich Mean Time. This is something I meant to put into the presentation, actually, so I'll segue a second here. If we think about local time is noon, let's say, in my position. So I used to live on the western slope of the Rocky Mountains. And 12 o'clock noon was actually about 11:58 a.m. because I was basing my clock on the meridian that ran through Denver. And that's Mountain Standard Time. And of course, they're based on New York, and New York again on Greenwich. So Greenwich time is now universal time. We've gone from this local time where, why do I care about your watch, Mr. Harrison? I can see the sun, the shadow tells me that it's noon. From the trains, it became absolutely necessary when society became that connected to have a mean time by which train schedules could be properly determined among the populace. So we moved in the Industrial Revolution from local time to the absolute need for mean time, and longitude certainly helped in this endeavor, to today, where we have universal time, which is required because we're extraterrestrial in the sense that we have satellites and, various systems that require a universal time. And universal time is based on Greenwich Mean Time, which is kind of interesting. So, England's longitude maybe gave us the maritime supremacy that led to English being one of the most widely spoken languages, if not in number, certainly I would argue in geographic extent, and time. Those are three things that I think strengthen the special relationship between the United States and England. So I think Harrison deserves a lot more credit than he has. And I'm going to get my numbers wrong here, but the BBC in 2006 or so did a poll of the British public for the most influential Britons of all time. I think Harrison was either in the low 30s or mid 20s. Number one was Churchill, And John Lennon was right up there. I think he was number 3 or number 2. So, any other questions? Oh, brother, yes.
Robert Umbaugh, past master of Cumberland Star Lodge 197 in Carlisle and member of Tricol Lodge here on campus. You mentioned a number of things, most especially in your answer to that question about Greenwich Mean Time, of things that happened at roughly the same time that longitude was established precisely, right around 1750 or that sort of thing, and established the British Royal Navy as the master of the seas. It didn't help them an awful lot in the Revolution. It didn't hurt, but
That's
it didn't help
true.
them an awful lot. But the point about Greenwich Mean Time being as important on land as longitude is on the seas, I would like to have your opinion of which is the more important, the more meaningful in the last 200 years of mankind.
That's a wonderful question. I would argue that on the sea, because it's easier to position on land. You can by knowing that the mountain by knowing that the mountain Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code novel, correct? That would otherwise have been in Paris. So I think that the longitude and latitude divisions had been discerned, if you will, at least 1,000 years before. There were some ancient Greek philosophers, Aristophanes, I think I mentioned, and another fellow whose name escapes me, Hippocrates of Sidon, I think it was, who had devised a graticulate system of spatial measurement, if that makes sense, to orient a person, but mainly on land. So I don't know exactly when they were fixed with their current, I mean, they're all degrees, so it's 360 degrees. They would depend on the equator and as to where those lines fall. So I think the 360 degrees with the 360 days of the year, if you will, sort of define those relationships. The real question becomes is where does the line actually lie on the globe because of microvariances in the shape of the sphere, the geoid. So you put 0 longitude on Greenwich, then you've got 180 degrees, over New Zealand somewhere over there. It's funny, if you've seen the international date line, it kind of moves around. Nobody wants to be tomorrow, so it's not even a straight line over there. That's where my brother lives, so. But good question, that's something else I'm going to look into now, so I appreciate it.
Hello. Michael Sachs, J. Simpson Africa Lodge, number 628. I have a question. Greenwich Mean Time was developed for the railroads in about 1845 or something of that sort.
Standard time.
It's not the Greenwich Mean Time.
I'm sorry?
The Greenwich Mean Time was developed for the railroads?
I would say that it was employed, yeah, it became adopted. How about that? Because of the railroads. You can't put at the time of when a train departs if it's going to be different in each place, if that makes sense.
Okay, so the Greenwich Mean Time was it a maritime function or was it a railroad function or a combination of both?
that's a very good distinction. I would argue that it is a combination of both. I think the time that we associate today with Greenwich Mean Time is probably more applicable to the railroads, because I don't think guys on land really cared about the longitude and keeping noon in London versus noon in the middle of the sea. But I'm pretty sure they might call noon in the middle of the sea Greenwich time, if that makes sense, when they're on the boats, because that's what they were drawing the discrepancy by. Every hour being 15 nautical miles in one direction or another. So I would leave my clock, my marine chronometer, would always have Greenwich time on it, no matter where I am. So when it says noon, I know it's noon in Greenwich, but it's like 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I can tell by the sun. That's why they always used to mark noon. So they'd go out there, they would get the sextant, and they would mark noon, and do their rituals, if you will. And then the captain would go down and check his watch and try to plot them on the map as to where they were, west or east of London, and use the latitude to get that grid. So I think the time that we identify today is, it's 1:30 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time or Eastern Daylight Time. I would argue that's the direct result of the industrial age, absolutely, and the railroads.
Yeah, Dave Alexander from Bellefonte Lodge 268. There are still variables other than time. Well, other than time, don't you still have to consider the sextant and the planets? Because on the sea, you have the effect of currents. You have the effects of advance and transfer when you turn a vessel.
Absolutely.
Which is all going to affect constant time, getting from one point to another point.
Well, yeah, but what is time, right? Time is the distance between events.
But dependent on other variables, it can take me more or less time to get from the
True.
exact same spot.
That's very true.
To
But
another
but the observation of an event at one location occurs at a time that is universal. But because we're talking about events, I'm on the other side of the earth. Like when it's noon here, even though it's exactly the same time, it's, say, midnight on the other side of the, if I went right through the earth, right? So it's noon here, the earth is rotating, it's midnight there. So we're sharing the same time, but because of the difference in space, we can orient ourselves relative to each other. So even these currents only put you in a different place for the observation of that event at a different time, if that makes sense.
So you're still dependent upon the celestial position and making an adjustment to the distance you've traveled based on not just time, but also the celestial position.
Well, I would say the celestial position is the time. So you mark, you're going to say, I'm traveling east for 2 days. Where am I now? I first get my first position by the, let's say, by the planetary alignments, and I know that I must be 32 nautical miles west of London, because, at 2 hours ago it was noon in London, and this event is happening now, and in my almanac, when I adjust the numbers, show that this is when it would happen. So I must be along this vertical meridian west of London. And then I would look at noon to get the North Star and approximate my latitude and draw my little cross on the map. And then I would take my compasses and I would draw an arc and say in a day's travel time, I'm going to be somewhere along this arc. And if I get blown off course, my observations the next day will show that I'm not there, I must be here. Correct? So the planets really, their interaction is significant of a time. No matter where you are on the Earth, it is just your position will change relative to the observation, if that makes sense. Okay.
So it's still a combination.
Yes, I mean it is. Yeah, time is so confusing to think about because it is these things that are happening. So
because even in your talk you mentioned that by the torque created on the hull of the vessel.
Right, that retarded the balances. Yes,
right.
That's correct.
And it changed the distance that you had traveled over a given period of time.
Well, it made his clock lose time faster. And he couldn't, so the distance between the events of his hands were changed by the acceleration forces. So his time was consistent. His measuring tool got retarded because he hadn't solved for that force. Right?
Would that be because his mechanism was mounted athwart ships instead of fore and aft?
Yeah, well, his was actually separate. So he had two springs and these two balances. And I don't know exactly how he solved for the pitch in the yaw and the side to side, but he had somehow strung them together, but he didn't account for the accelerative force that inertia would slow down the spring, if you will, or extend it while it's moving in that direction. So yes, I think you could say yes, he hadn't solved the relative
advance
position.
or transfer.
Right, and he ended up with a circular balance, and I'm not a neurologist, so correct me if I'm wrong, to avoid this kind of antagonistic relationship between the parts, I guess, if that makes sense.
And
But it's
that would be one variable.
that would be, yes, you're right. Sure, in the measuring of time.
Right.
So right, we've got two times. This gets back to our conversation, Ted, from last night. We have the phenomenon and the noumenon. The noumenon being, let's say, the external objective time, which is like the metronome beating into nowhere. Right now we're using the oscillation of strontium atoms to count this regular rhythm of equidistant intervals. So we'll call that the noumenon.
We still have chronometers aboard
Yeah, the
ship.
phenomenon is the measuring, the witnessing of time. And when we're using objects to measure it, we change it by measuring it, so to speak, and things happen. It's interesting to think about this, too. This was one of humanity's great leaps, scientific understandings, was Einstein conflating space and time into space-time, which confused the heck out of me when I was a kid. But I finally think I understand what he has done with that concept. And I would, even though he mathematically articulated it, I would argue people like Harrison and Al-Biruni and some of these weird astronomical people who've watched heaven have been aware of that fact forever. Because the way that they would divide the day and the night, originally you'd have 12 equal hours of daylight and then 12 equal hours of darkness. So in the equinox, the hours would actually match the hours we have today. They'd be 60 minutes long. But in the summer, the hours would be longer. They would be like 63 minutes, depending on where you are on the globe. The further north you go, the longer the hours get. And these were the daylight hours and then the night hours. So these powers, if you will, were said to be openings through which forces would govern the world. The angels would extend their rulership through these moments. So the idea of the turning of the time is the movement of these rulerships, if you will, to the Renaissance mind, across the globe, across the living space. And I know some of you understand what I'm talking about. You can also apply the idea of letters to these degrees. And the movement of times is the movement of letters that spell out words, if you will. And these words are the utterances of the divine creative force, which governs the manifestation, if you will, of all things. So again, space and time are one and the same phenomenon. To occupy space is to move in time. One is the experience of the other. Does that make sense? It's like electricity and magnetism.
And Einstein dealt with his variabilities too,
He did.
like
Yeah.
gravity and
Right.
its effect on space-time.
Right, that's
Where
relative,
I would
yeah.
think in the seas, current would be one of those variables.
Yes,
that you
and
would have to-
actually magnetism and gravity is not constant on the globe either. So that all these things do affect the subtleties of clocks. Yes, that's a good point. Yes, you're absolutely correct.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ted, could I
Yes.
interject something? I taught English Lit for 32 years and absolutely loved the Enlightenment time period, the 18th century. And I'm just curious, in studying about longitude and latitude, what other things did you become interested in along with that?
Wow, that's a huge question. A lot of things. I mean, I was fascinated by the fact that this problem persisted for so long. And the solution is so elegant. I mean, I would love to understand horology. I don't think I have time to check that book out of the library, and read it to the level that would be required. But just the mechanics of a watch, to be able to take these motions and fold them into one compact object and enable a regular counting, it blows my mind. I really admire folks who are able to do that. I argue that everything did come from above. Everything did come from on high, because determining the movement of the spheres was what engendered math. in a sense, right? You need to know when to sow. You need to know when to reap. And the rising of the ascendant over the sky draws the circle, and the mathematics of the circle, pi, the mysterious pi, and the golden ratio, the mysterious, is it phi or phi? I don't know how you pronounce that one, but you know the letter I mean. For me, it increased my love of the mystery, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Thank you. It is a mystery, isn't it?
Hi, my name is Francis. I'm
Hi,
from
Francis.
J. Simpson, Africa, lodge number 628. Not to argue about the Greenwich Mean Time, but just knowing that the Greenwich Mean Time is situated, it goes through England. Wouldn't it be better? This is just my thing.
Now, hold on a second.
Wouldn't it be better if they would have taken, not to say it's not relevant, but Egypt, the pyramids of Egypt, which are aligned to the celestial path, don't you think that would have been better taken as a mean time?
Francis, my answer would be better for whom? Yes,
Yeah.
no, that's a very good question. It's relative. It doesn't really matter where that prime meridian is settled, ultimately.
Oh.
Just that it is somewhere, because we have to begin the day on a globe somewhere, correct?
Yep, ultimately it's so close to the equator, so...
But you bring up a really good point with the pyramids. I mean, I don't know if this is true, but this is what I've heard, that they align with the belt of Orion, with Alnatak, Mantaka, and Alnath, and show the precession of the equinoxes, which is a very long cycle, right? 26,000 years or something.
The pyramids in South America, how are they connected to the pyramids in Egypt? The guy didn't travel from Egypt to South America to build pyramids there. So there is something, there is a force, there is a celestial phenomenon. There are also pyramids in India. There are also pyramids in China.
And Croatia,
so,
right?
Yeah. So how did these people decide that they got to build pyramids? There's got to be a celestial...
It's something fundamental to humanity. I mean, before electric light pollution, imagine I've seen the night sky. If you've ever been in the middle of the ocean and looked up, right? If you've ever been in the middle of the desert and looked up, and it is phenomenal. There's not one of us who has the gift of sight who wouldn't wonder about those stars and notice the changing of them. Like some rotate evenly, but different ones rise at different times, right? They disappear in the winter. The sun obscures them. And then you've got the bright planet, Venus, beautifully dignified, bejeweled in the west, right? And she's symbolically significant of beauty the world over. It doesn't matter what culture you go to. So this determination of these astral spheres, whatever the heck it is up there, has engendered, I believe, most of our belief systems. I would argue that those pyramids in Maya, incredible. And the reflecting pools that they used, I believe they were measuring the stars by reflecting them in shallow pools so that they could mark with lines, with, if you will, celestial latitudes and longitudes, strings, their positions, and do the measurements, which are still only off by a number of minutes today. And they were using, like, I don't know, base 6 and base 13 or something, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, so my point being, can somebody think of moving the Greenwich Mean Time now? And putting it up.
Francis, you're asking the wrong person, I'll tell you that right now.
Thank you.
If I had that authority, no, I think it should stay exactly where it is. Greenwich is a great place. It's Greenwich.
Brian Versetti, Omni Lodge number 582. Obviously, I've never had the need to use one, but especially after your discussion today, are you able to explain the basic principles or how to use the sextant?
The sextant I probably could explain. I believe it's simply really just an altimeter, if you will. It's a, what do you call that, an azimuth calculator? It's a protractor. And you kind of look through and you sight your object, and then you measure the angle between the horizon and that object, and that gives you your latitude. This is a great experiment. Do you know how to find the North Star? You know where the Big Dipper is, right? Yeah. So you find the North Star, and what you do is you stand there and you put your hand, by a curious optical phenomenon, everybody's fist is approximately 10 degrees. If you have bigger hands, you probably have longer arms. You know what I mean? So it's fairly constant as a pretty good estimate. And you put it at eye level at the horizon, and you count fists between the horizon and the North Star, and it's a pretty fair estimation of your latitude. I know Denver's about 38 north, so I don't know where we are. Are we further south in Pennsylvania? Are we north in Pennsylvania? Is this like 42? 44? 40. So you are 2 degrees north of Denver, thereabouts, maybe. I don't know if I'm right about that, actually. So you should be able to get 4 fists between the horizon and the North Star. So try it and let me know what happens. If I'm way off, could be. So that's the sextant. Anyway, that's essentially I think that's how the sextant operates. And the astrolabe is also very interesting. It's a similar deal. On the back of an astrolabe, it's got something like a sextant. It's usually got a sighting means on one end, and you rotate it through the degrees to get the azimuth of the star. And then on the other side, it's got an incredibly intricate list of markings that show the position of the so-called fixed stars at the times of year. So I don't really know how to read one. I bought one at the Ren Fair in Larkspur, and it's made for Denver. I really don't know how to use it. It's all in Arabic, unfortunately, but it's cool. It really is cool.
Brother Williams, I had a question for you.
Yes, sir.
2 questions for you. I wanted to ask, like, with Brother Harrison's work, how did it compare to Piri Reis from the Ottoman Empire in his cartography?
Okay.
How was that in terms of longitude and latitude? And my second question is, if you could teach me how to have an accent like yours.
Well, the second I could help with. The first, I'm afraid I don't know. So I'll have to look into that too. I'm learning a lot from you guys here. That's a very good question. You know, map making is not my skill set. And maybe Robert D'Alzo, let me get your email and I'll look into that for you too. I got 3 things to look into here, if I can remember what they all are. So thank you. But the English accent, yeah, we'll just have to hang out more. Come to Denver. That'd be great.
We have a question from the internet, Brother Matthew Randolph. Was there a specific equation that was used to predict the arrival of a vessel with a clock over traditional navigation, and how did the variables of current and weather enter into it?
There you go. Yes, it's a very good question. No, I think ultimately it was a rote exercise that was performed daily to ascertain one's position, and then they would predict landfall. They would raise the land. I love this. They would bring the land out of the sea. They wouldn't arrive. They would raise the land, because that's what they were doing, if that makes sense. They'd bring it out of the sea. And they would, I guess they would predict that based on the log and the line, you know, knowing that we're about 6 knots on average today. We should see the land here, and it should be the Scilly Isles, and we should be safely west of them, Sir Cloudsley, I assure you. And if you're right, you're okay. If you're not, then you're not. So I don't know if there was any specific equation. There were very, very complex equations in the lunary method in just determining the longitude, and I haven't looked at the mathematics of that. I'm afraid it far exceeds my ability. I would love to be able to do that. You would actually be able to, you know, build an almanac pretty much using mathematics. So Ben Franklin would have been somewhat familiar with that, I would believe. But great question. So I don't know if that answered it or not.
Well, I think it's about time for lunch. Lunch will be downstairs. Recommended donation of $10 if you think this has been worthwhile. And I do have a question for Brother Ben, though. So suppose that the universe froze solid, no motion whatsoever, even the strontium atom isn't vibrating. So my question to you is, would the universe be getting any older?
That's a great question.
We can discuss that over lunch.
Wow. Absolute zero. Right?
Right.
The absolute zero.
Well, thank you, Brother Ben.